Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to thank Harker School for organizing this event. It's my first visit to your beautiful campus, and I hope it won't be my last one. I'm going to talk about supporting Indigenous survival. I'm going to go through this, like my colleagues did, rather quickly, and my theme really is about how the tribe is a living social and political unit. Instead of going back to these old maps that anthropologists draw about language families and culture areas from the past, the Muwekma Ohlone people speak English and Chochenyo. And we don't need to talk about them speaking Tamian or Remetosh or any of these other languages. The Muwekma Ohlone people speak English and Chochenyo. The use of maps like this that show different cultural areas and different language groups are really used to confuse and divide and disenfranchise the tribe as a political unit, ignoring the historical evolution of Indigenous communities and their identity, and their continuing change and evolution as political and social communities. And then we're going to talk briefly about the Muwekma Ohlone have always been multicultural and multilingual. Not just today, they've always been multicultural and multilingual. They're a political and social organization and group, and they should be allowed to change over time, just like we all do, without losing any sense of their authenticity or their ancient heritage here. We've already talked a little bit about the legacy of the mission system. I have a series of maps. We'll go through them fast. Understanding that the mission system was about dislocating and controlling Indigenous people, but this is not total dislocation. This is not the total obliteration of culture, as we've already heard. There's resistance, there's escape, there's persistence, but there's also this radical reorganization of social and political and linguistic communities. Stage one, the missions are established beginning in 1776, Mission Dolores in what's now San Francisco, and Mission Santa Clara, drawing people from the peninsula and the San Jose area into those two missions because the missions need their labor. In the second stage, they add Mission San Jose. They move people around between these missions, right? These are people who spoke each other's languages. They intermarried with each other. They had long histories together, but they're now dislocated by the Spanish mission system and moved around as captive labor on the landscape, while the mission systems and the soldiers are going out and collecting people from further away, collecting people from the North Bay, collecting people from the interior, collecting people from the coast. New communities are forming inside the missions, new multicultural communities, and persistent communities are still surviving out on the landscape and resisting this conquest. They're resisting colonialism. They're burning missions, right? This is not just some simple total thing, the Spanish arrive, the missions, it's all over, as Mike has pointed out. And Lee does very well in his books as well. In stage three, more missions in the North Bay, more people being brought in by force from farther away, and the ancestors of Muwekma Ohlone being moved even further, right? Moved up into the North Bay to build those missions, moved back if somebody needs more labor in San Francisco or they need more people in San Jose. People are being radically, these communities are being radically formed, combined and recombined in the mission system. And then the Franciscans got in trouble politically in Mexico. And people began to see the value of breaking up the missions and taking their land and giving it to colonists. And so we have the secularization of the missions beginning in the 1830s, and many of the Muwekma Ohlone ancestors leave the missions. Who wouldn't, right, leave the missions? And they go back to their homelands and try to find a safe place to live. And so you'll see this dispersal that happens from the missions in this time period. But what else is going on? The Mexican government is giving away their land. And there were 3 Muwekma Ohlone ancestors who received land grants. None of them held that land for more than 5 years. Because once you privatize it and monetize the land, it's very easy for someone to buy it from you, for you to owe somebody money and them to take your land in return for that debt. None of those land grants to Ohlone people were held for more than 10 years. So their land goes away. It's really interesting to think about Mike's work up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. You'll see that hole where nobody claimed the land. That's one of the places that the Muwekma Ohlone people went as they were getting pushed out of these private land grants. There's a brief period between about 1840 actually and 1860 where there are multiple villages of Muwekma Ohlone people, what are called in anthropology rancherias in the Bay Area. There was one at the former Mission Rancho in San Mateo, the rancho that was associated with Mission Dolores, near Coyote Point, near the San Francisco airport. There was a community of Ohlone people living there. In fact, one of their descendants was at Coyote Point shooting trespassers in the 1930s. If they tried to dock their boats, he would shoot at them, tried to hold on to his land. Joe Avencio. There was a community near Mission Santa Clara, there was a community in San Jose, there was a community in San Leandro, there were communities in Niles and Verona and Alisal, surviving communities of Muwekma Ohlone people. The other thing I would say about this is the time period after American colonial conquest of Mexico, of this part of Mexico. And in this time period, the Spanish and Mexican land grantees are attempting to prove their legal title to land. And so Americans can't claim land yet. That's why these rancherias are allowed to sit out there, is because Americans can't grab it from them yet. They'll get to that. So in this next stage of American colonial displacement, when the Spanish have clear land title and the Mexican land grantees, and they have to pay their lawyers, it took a lot of money to keep your land title in California in this time period, they start selling off land to Americans. Spanish and Mexican agricultural families relied on Muwekma Ohlone labor to herd their cattle and their sheep and plant their crops and harvest their crops and care for their children and weave their clothing. You could live on a Mexican rancho and survive as a Muwekma Ohlone person. Americans did not want Native Americans on their land. And so all of those rancherias get consolidated into a single rancheria, sort of a super rancheria with these tiny little satellites to it. And that is, in fact, Alisal, which becomes the federally recognized tribe of the Verona Band. They were pushed out eventually of Alisal by the Hearst family who owned that land in about 1910. And they dispersed into the East Bay and the South Bay. The surviving members of the Verona Band wind up in the East Bay and the South Bay. And they continue their relationships with each other. They continue to recognize traditional leadership, and they continue as a tribal community. So let's fast forward, okay, 1980, more or less, to today. Here's a map of house prices in California, all right? So here are the Muwekma Ohlone people who have managed to survive and work hard. Charlene's father, right, worked for Leslie Salt. Her uncle, who I knew, worked for granite rock construction. Her mother was a nurse. Her aunts worked in canneries. They worked in silicon chip factories. They worked their way into the middle class and are able to afford homes in the East Bay and the South Bay. This is what's happening now, where Charlene's children cannot afford a $1 million house in San Jose. And so we're getting another moment where we're really threatened with displacement because of gentrification. And this is a major threat that Charlene and I both recognize to the persistence of the Muwekma Ohlone in their homeland. What can we do about it? Well, the land back movement is a really interesting idea, and certainly something that I support. It has a poison pill in it that we have to be really careful about. Managing land costs money, right? And it comes with risk, and it comes with liabilities, and it comes with responsibility. And I'm really concerned, and I know that Mike and Charlene understands this, that people will start to dump undevelopable land on tribes because they don't want to be responsible for wildfire or fencing or squatters or the homeless or all the other responsibilities that come with owning land. And so giving the Ohlone people land that has a conservation easement on it is really not as helpful as you think. It's like greenwashing. You're going to get great press release for giving land back to the tribe. But what you're really doing is dumping responsibility on them. They want land so bad that they probably will take it. But I would caution them about that, because what they really need to survive as a native species in this area, an endangered native species in their homeland, is allowing them to live on their conservation lands, not just steward nature preserves that we walk through and look at butterflies on. Survival of indigenous communities in their native habitat requires sovereignty and economic development and affordable housing. We need to reintroduce native people to nature. They need to be able to live on their land. We have to redefine that in conservation. Mid-Peninsula Open Space District ought to have Muwekma Ohlone villages living in it, right? State parks ought to have Muwekma villages living on them. And so we're going to need together to realize that nature includes native people, that we can have natural spaces and they can have native people in them. So I'm really calling on all of you to support Muwekma's vision of restoring native people to the homeland and to help them sustain Ohlone communities in their homelands and to restore sovereignty and self-determination. Thank you.